The book of Ruth is not a template for what a strategic plan should look like. It is a story, as one commentator wrote, of what people do in desperate circumstances with limited options. They would not have designed their lives this way. And with that in mind, I was looking at our mail this week, and because David went to a certain school in California that no one who is a true Husky actually likes, but they're a pretty good school, Stanford, and not that this is an issue in our marriage, and so we get this magazine from the alums, and what it said on the front, and this is why I'm holding it up, is by chance, the many roles of randomness. And I thought, well, that's kind of random that comes in just before I preach on a part of the story that has a number of things that seemingly happen by chance. The articles in here that talk about related concepts of randomness, probability, frequency, predictability, incompressibility, many more things. There's one article about tidying up. How many of you did a fair amount of tidying up during the pandemic? How many of you wish you'd done more tidying up during the pandemic when you had all that time on your hands, right? One of the people who teaches at Stanford said, so much feels out of our control at a world level right now that it is impacting our mental health. The impossibility of predicting bad things, even if they are not totally random, is causing a lot of angst. She talked about how organizing can be a coping mechanism against constant change and a lack of control, because the mind has this natural distaste for randomness. We want predictability. We want control. So with wars and plagues and natural disasters and social inequities, economic uncertainty, even the high price of gas, it's not surprising that, if you can organize a sock drawer, you might feel just a little bit better, right? But there is this intolerance of uncertainty, another Stanford professor talked about, the dispositional tendency to fear the unknown. And this tendency to fear the unknown can lead us to certain behaviors and reactions, particularly to others. In Ruth chapter 2, there's a great deal of uncertainty coming into it. Last week, Matt talked about disruptors and life quakes, and we could relate to that. But there's also this question of, can we discern a pattern in the way that God is at work? This is what we want to know. In the midst of all the uncertainty, the circumstances we can't control, all that big stuff out there, there a God who's bigger still, who knows what to do with all this randomness, with all this chance. Is there a pattern to the way he's at work? Is there a hope, and can we have confidence that there is a good news story that's emerging in the middle of the story that we're living right now? You may also know that Ruth chapter 2 is important for a second reason. Not only our need to know there's a good news story that in the midst of chance or randomness, it's also important because it emphasizes Ruth's identity as a foreigner, as a Moabite. You heard it over and over again in this. And there's a particular uncertainty and displacement in Ruth's pledge of loyalty to Naomi and Naomi's God that has plunged her into uncertainty. Now, when things are uncertain, we look for patterns. You may also know that my husband, David, is the head of a nonprofit called AI, Artificial Intelligence and Faith. And machine learning, this is one of the things with the artificial intelligence that we look at, is we try to look, machine learning looks for patterns, right? Looks for patterns in the chaos and the randomness. And there's a famous story of the Chihuahua in the snow. Do you know this story? I may have told it before because it's one of the only ones I can understand. And two, I love this story, that they'd taken this machine learning computer to try to teach it the difference when it looked at a picture between a dog and a wolf, right? So they'd show it we're talking thousands and thousands of pictures. This is a dog. This is a wolf. This is a dog. This is a wolf. This is a dog. This is a wolf. So the machine can learn to predict if it's looking at a dog or a wolf. And they figured, we've got it. We've accomplished this now. And they go to use it, and this machine sees a Chihuahua and calls it a wolf. And then they have to figure out, how on earth can this mistake a Chihuahua for a wolf? Well, what they hadn't realized is that over and over and over again, the pictures they showed of wolves had snow in the background. So the machine looked at the snow and said, wolf. That was the pattern, right? As you know, these are the problems with some of this and the challenges with a lot of AI. because there are prejudices and stereotypes that get fed into, and we look for predictability. In uncertain times, we can use prejudice and stereotype to look for predictability. We see snow, and we make an assumption. And when there is a lot of fear, when there is a lot of uncertainty, we especially do this with the stranger, with the person who is other than ourselves. We look for predictability stereotypes of people who are different. We know that xenophobia has been a real problem, not only in the story of Ruth, but in our own times, particularly over the last 2 years. Xenophobia is a fear of strangers. And one of the Old Testament scholars that I was looking at with the book of Ruth is a woman named Gail Yee, and reflecting on Ruth's story and her own experiences as a Chinese American, she describes one of those stereotypes of Asian Americans, as well as the model minority stereotype, as being the perpetual foreigner. She recounts how she's often asked, where do you come from? And she'll say, Chicago. And people say, well, no, where do you really come from? And if she wants to take it further, she'll say, well, I live in Boston, and I've lived in Canada, and now I also, and she'll tell everywhere she lives, but she knows what they're going for is, where are you really from? Who are your people, right? Because there is a sense that to be Asian American is to be the perpetual foreigner. No matter how many generations, this isn't your place. In the middle of public and political conflicts, our question here today is not what makes a person American, but it is, how do we, as believers, interact with those who have the experience and are treated as foreign or other. When I did a Google search on xenophobia, it's interesting because on the first 5, 6, 7 pages of this Google search, I could maybe find one article on the fear or reaction to anyone of Asian or Latino, Mexican, Arab descent in America. Everything was about race, and particularly black and white. Now that is an important topic. In fact, it's important enough that in the first 4 weeks in September, while I'm on sabbatical, Pastor Aaron Williams will be preaching here on reconciliation and the gospel. We'll be leading a class on the color of compromise. Very important book about race and black and white relationships in America. And I encourage you to mark your calendars for that. But what can happen, that Professor Yee points out, is that there can be a falling in the gap, a falling through the cracks of the experience of Asian Americans, people of Mexican, Latino, Hispanic descent, Arab Americans. We've heard stories of fear and violence and uncertainty, and this story from Ruth is one that particularly makes us look at and pay attention to how do we respond, what is both the experience of the foreigner or someone who's perceived as a foreigner, and what is our response. How do we get our Christian identity out ahead of our national identity? How do we keep our Christian call and identity out ahead of any national identity? So let's hold two things together as we look at this chapter in Ruth. I want to hold the uncertainties in our own stories that we all share, no matter what our background. The uncertainties we all share and our desire to look for God's pattern and God's engagement with those uncertainties. And then we also want to ask the question that this passage, this story is asking us, is presenting to us about relationships with the foreigner, with the migrant. The story of the world, one person has written, is a story of migrating peoples, and this is Ruth's story. Notice how often in this, if you look back at your Bibles, you can open up your devices or look in your Bible, how often Ruth is called the Moabite, even when it's not really necessary, right? So in verse 2, it says, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi. It doesn't say Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law. It doesn't say Ruth, the widow of Naomi's son. We know who Ruth is. We've been following the story. She's Ruth the Moabite, says to Naomi. Later on, down in verse 6, when the overseer is asked by Boaz, who are her people, the first two things he answers is she's from Moab and she's a Moabite. And she happens to be here with Naomi. That lets you know who, in his eyes, her people are. Right? Later on, in verse 21, again, I love this about the narrator, and this is how you know they're trying to keep this in front of us. Verse 21, it's Ruth the Moabite who answers Naomi, right? We know she's a Moabite. Ruth the Moabite answered. It's like the narrator saying, keep this in mind. Don't miss this, okay? Because remember, the Moabites were despised by Israel. There's a long history behind this. And there's especially not only that Ruth is a Moabite, but she's a Moabite woman. And in Israelite history, the Moabite women are especially dangerous. The Moabite women are known to lead the Israelite men away through sexual temptation to foreign gods. This is the story, all up to this time. There is this combination of a certain way you see a Moabite woman, right? It's like the difference between the way, we might say you see a Czechoslovakian woman and an Italian woman, right? The Moabite is the more sex figure in here. So this is what Ruth's up against. And remember, too, we're living in a time of extreme violence against foreign women, non-Israelite women, Israelite women as well. But the end of Judges ends with a horrifying story of a woman and violence against a concubine, a foreign concubine. So Ruth's in a dangerous situation. Ruth's own witness is that she's going to need someone who will show her favor in verses 2 and verse 10. She highlights her status as a foreigner in verse 10 with Boaz when she says, why would you show me favor? I'm a foreigner. Why would you give me standing? Even Naomi's witness and Boaz's witness lets us know the precarious position that Ruth is in. Naomi says at the end, stay there. You are not safe in other places. You'll stay safe there. And Boaz gives strict instructions of how Ruth is to be treated. He doesn't leave anything to chance among his workers on how to treat her. Being both migrant and a woman adds a level of exposure to Ruth. It reminded me, how many of you have seen either the original or the remake of West Side Story? Yeah, and you remember when Anita, who is heading to the pharmacy near the end. Anita's going to take an important message, a message that will help save this story. But she is received as a Puerto Rican woman, and she's attacked by the boys who are in the pharmacy. And the whole story turns. Because that rather than receiving her as Anita, she is taken in as this enemy and a woman who is vulnerable. And the story turns. Well, Ruth's story turned in a different direction because this is not how she was received. Ruth in this story needs two things. She needs to find favor. Another way to read this word in the Hebrew is finding rest. You can relate to anyone who's living subsistence poverty. Anyone who's living with a sense of being other or a stranger or an outsider knows how exhausting that is. To find rest is to find favor is to find rest from that. Not having to worry about where food's coming from the next day. The amount of grain that she brought back was enough for several days at the end. Not having to worry about her safety. She needs to go someplace where she can find favor, where she's protected and finds rest. And the second thing that Ruth needs is she needs to be seen, not as the Moabite from Moab, as the stereotype of someone who leads Israelite men astray, but seen for who she is. Someone who has arrived in a foreign country, who is aware of the hostility she is facing, but has made obligations and promises, who is faithful and good and kind to someone she loves who is in grief. So Ruth takes the initiative. Now here's what I want us to notice at this point. What Ruth is doing isn't just scrappy and practical. It's also an act of worship. Here's how. When she came with Naomi to Israel, she pledged, your God will be my God. And in that pledge, your God will be my God and your people will be my people, in the law of Israel, she's protected as a poor widow to glean. So what Ruth does is she takes some initiative of saying, I belong to this Lord. I have pledged to this Lord. And because I pledged myself to the Lord, the laws apply to me. I also have the right to go gleaning. Now, gleaning was subsistence. What would happen is in the harvest, Let me show you how much I don't know about harvesting, okay? This is, every once in a while you get to a sermon where my knowledge is only this deep. This is a moment, right? So if I'm about, I know, Gretchen, it's shocking, but this is one of them. So if I explain this wrong and you know more about harvesting than me, correct me afterwards, okay? But here's my best understanding, is that they go along and they cut these sheaves, they cut the grain very close to the ground, and they gather up the sheaves, and they gather up as much as they can, and when it gets to a certain point, they put it off to the side. And later they will come, put this together, and take it along. But in that process, every once in a while, a little bit falls out. And it's that little bit that falls out that the poor are allowed to glean, the poor are allowed to gather. It's subsistence. It would be like going around and collecting, back in the day when you could collect aluminum cans and get money for them. It'd be like living on that. That's what gleaning is. And Ruth is savvy. She believes and knows that because she has taken shelter under the wing of the Lord of Israel, she's pledged herself to the Lord, she's taken shelter under his wing, that this law appeals to her so she can go out. She also knows she needs to find someone who will show her favor, because not everyone will recognize her status. Not everyone will allow her to work and keep her safe. There are these wonderful verses in the Old Testament about the kind of shelter that Ruth is depending upon from the Lord. Do you know this one from Psalm 91? He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be to you your shield and your rampart. Or from Psalm 61, I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you, God, have heard my vows. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. This is Ruth's prayer. It's a risk, and it's a risk of faith that she's going out to live in that shelter. And taking that risk, the story takes a turn. And we begin to see the pattern in the way that the Lord, the God of Israel, works in situations that on the surface might seem like chance. And the narrator plays this up. This is such good storytelling. So in verse 2-3, he just says, by chance, right? It just so happened she ended up in Elimelech's field. It's like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink from the narrator, right? It's like, if you're watching a Hallmark romance, that by chance these people are going to meet, right? This is, maybe you don't, but I watched too many of those during the pandemic. I'm off them now, by the way. I've gone through detox. But by chance, right? The narrator is so good about this. And even the next one, in verse 2-4, when it says, let me find it here, when it says, just then Boaz arrived, in the Hebrew, this is a word of surprise. Oh, hey, look, what do you know? Boaz is on the scene, right? There's this wonderful storytelling where it's like, we all know listening to the story, this isn't by chance. The Lord to whom Ruth has given herself is looking after Ruth. But in the storytelling, sometimes when you're living in the middle of the story, it takes some discernment to know what's happening here by chance and where's the Lord at work. You know it in hindsight, right? Ruth took the initiative to risk working, and the Lord was right there. And now she finds herself in a field of another person, Boaz, whose actions are exactly in line with the worship of a God who cares for the widow and the poor and the alien. Did you notice how Boaz addresses Ruth? Can you see that? If you look at verse 8, what does he call her? Can you see it there? Anybody still got their Bibles open? It's okay if you don't, I'm just asking. My daughter. All the way through, it's Ruth the Moabite. The Moab. She's from Moab. She's a Moabite. And Boaz looks at her and says, my daughter. The same greeting, the same thing that Naomi calls her. He's gone to kinship. He's gone to kinship. It stands out in the middle of all these Ruth the Moabite descriptions. Boaz's actions go above and beyond the letter of the law in an age when you have to remember every man was doing what was right in his own eyes. And in Boaz's eyes, what was right was what was in alignment with the Lord, the God of Israel. The Lord, the God of Israel, who says in Deuteronomy 10:18, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you. giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. So Ruth's pluckiness, right, is this act of faith, is this act of worship. And we see in Boaz that his love for the foreigner is also an act of worship. This is Boaz's worship in the public place. This makes it clear in a chaotic time when there are a lot of views and a lot of danger out there that he is doing what the Lord his God would have him do and reflecting who the Lord his God is. And so he gives favor to Ruth. And secondly, did you notice how it's emphasized that Boaz sees Ruth? Did you hear that? If you look down in here, Ruth says to him, in verse 10, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me? There can be a certain stare, there can be a certain look that people give to the stranger, to the outsider. And then there's the way that Boaz sees Ruth and notices Ruth. And later, Naomi says, who is this that noticed you? Who is this that noticed you? Naomi praises Boaz. So here Ruth ends up in the field with somebody who does not see her as some Moabite, foreign female, but he sees her capacities and he sees her actions. I know what you've done for your mother-in-law. I've heard the stories. I've seen your faithfulness, your chesed. There's that word that's so important in this story. And the first person it's applied to at this point is Ruth, for her actions, her compassionate loyalty to Naomi. Boaz sees it. He sees Ruth in light of her character and her actions. He sees her. And then the second person chesed is applied to is Boaz. When Naomi says in verse 20, the Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. And there's a wonderful, this is the thing, Hebrew's such an amazing language. And you can see things from a few different angles. And everybody debates, who's showing kindness here? Is it the Lord showing kindness to the living and the dead? Because most translations would say, then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. That it's the Lord whose kindness has not forsaken the living and the dead. But it can equally be translated, just as the NIV did here, that Boaz is the one who's showing a kindness that has not forsaken the living and the dead. And this is what happens in the book of Ruth, right? Is that this prayer that Boaz gives, may you find shelter under the Lord's wing, is exactly the thing that Boaz is doing. He's protecting her. He's making sure she gets not only what the law says she's allowed, but even extra. He's making sure she's included and she's kin. He's making sure that she is kept safe. You see how it's almost inseparable. The very thing that Boaz is praying for her, that she finds shelter under the wing and the protection of the Lord, is the very thing that Boaz then enacts also on her behalf. He is living even as he prays. He is living even as he prays. And he is extending himself beyond what is required for her sake. You can't really separate the Lord's loyalty from that of Boaz. So during that encounter, Ruth and Boaz emerge as people of this extraordinary character, people whose kindness and loyalty extends them out beyond what is required. For Ruth, into places of risk, and fully entrusting herself to the protection of God. And for Boaz, in extending his standing, his wealth, his capacity to look after another. So I have three thoughts about us then, out of this story and in the midst of our stories. The first, as I said, this applies to all of us, whether or not, wherever we are. And that is that in the midst of uncertainty and chaos, we take shelter. We continue to take shelter in the Lord who is fully revealed in Jesus Christ, that he is our place of shelter. The benefit of disruptors, the benefit of life quakes, is that they expose any temporary or any shelter that can't last, any foundation that can't last, and bring us back to the only place of true shelter and care, which is the Lord our God revealed in Jesus Christ. The whole story of Ruth wants us to see and be assured of the certainty of God's care and protection for God's people. And for those of us who are like dyed in the wool, it's not bad to be a dyed in the world Reformed Protestant, right? Which means that it's all grace and nothing we do, right? Ruth's message might make us a little uncomfortable because right at the center of Ruth, verse 12 could be a summary of this whole book. When Boaz says to Ruth, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." It's like the summary of the whole story is that whoever seeks shelter under the wings of the God of Israel will be rewarded. And that is true. It's completely dependent upon the grace of God, but like my friend Tony in Scotland used to say, God is no person's debtor. He used to say God is no man's debtor, but I made Tony like, see what I did there? Yeah, God is no man's debtor. The Lord looks after God's people. To pay attention to that in this chance and this randomness that the Lord looks after those who participate by trusting God's loyalty to them, and because they trust that, extending it to others. This is the thread, this is the predictability, this is the snow, if you will, of the whole story, is loyalty. That the Lord in Jesus Christ has pledged loyalty to us so we can risk loyalty to others. And there are two places we see this risk taking place in this particular story. The first is to risk in places of vulnerability where we require the favor or the rest of others in order to be seen. This is a really important story for anyone who finds themselves feeling invisible or with the experience of being invisible. Or for anyone who finds themselves with the life experience of needing to try to be invisible because when they're seen as foreign or with stereotypes or as less. It's especially important for those who are navigating places where there's fear of the other. For anyone who's non-white, who is navigating spaces where stereotypes, such as the perpetual foreigner, or the pressure to be the model minority, or this burden of other people assuming they know your story because they see your ethnicity. It's an act of faith to take shelter in Christ and Christ's identity. To risk initiative as one who knows the grace and gaze of God is what defines you. And out of that grace and gaze of God, to, in risky places, step forward into the places where God has invited. Also extending grace to others. There are people I know and love in my own friendship and family who I know their experience of the way that they are seen is very often through these stereotypes. And I think the risks they take and the loyalty they show to others are astounding. To risk and initiate acting in loyalty to God is an act of worship. To take that encouragement from Ruth. And second, too, this is an important story for all of us in this congregation. We are a majority white, historically middle-class congregation. We're a congregation that doesn't talk a whole lot about migrants or immigration because there's a lot of political static around it and some anxiety around that. But we're also a congregation who worships the God who loves the foreigner. And we can get distracted by anxieties and political static and miss the opportunity to worship in our public actions where we put our faith in Jesus Christ out ahead of our identity as citizens. There's an encouragement in Boaz's example to actually look and see, to hear the stories and know the stories. This week, as well as, as you can tell, I always Google whatever I'm interested in, right? But the second place I like to look is Christianity Today magazine. Because I realized that, Laurie, I haven't been looking. I haven't been curious enough about what's happening for the people who are migrants. And especially Ruth's story is the poor migrant, the person who comes looking for work who is a foreigner and is poor. And I learned that there is an editor in Christianity Today, that her whole job is just stories about migrants in particular, and also immigrants. And the stories were astounding to read them. And it was so convicting to realize I haven't been looking. I haven't been looking and I haven't been seeing, and so I haven't been engaging because I'm so tired of the political discourse. But it's no excuse. And when we miss these stories, we can miss the fact that God is still working in very much the ways that he worked in Ruth's story. Let me just tell you one to close up. This is a story I came across of a man named Felix Chavez. Now, Felix Chavez immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico. He was 59 years old in the spring of 2021, and you may remember, you may not, that spring, what happened in San Antonio was that the Office of Refugee Resettlement temporarily housed 1,500 boys ages 13 to 17 who had come across the border, who were seeking asylum, who were fleeing violence in the southern hemisphere. And there was a great uproar about this in San Antonio. Well, for Felix Chavez and his fellow Young Life leaders, they had been trying to get a new Young Life club started in the middle of the pandemic in nearby high schools and not having a great deal of success. But then this happened, and as one of their leaders said, I saw that as our side of town. God called us to it. For this Young Life team, the politics were not a deterrent. The Freeman Coliseum was in the right place at the right time. It just so happened. But the problem was they couldn't get in. And Chavez said, he was so frustrated, he just wanted to go bust down the doors and get in there with these kids. But he felt the Spirit of God telling him to be patient, that God would open the doors. What ended up happening is he was able to partner with a local Catholic charity. And the local Catholic charities got the Young Life teams in. And inside they found boys who mostly wore government-issued clothing. They had few personal belongings. What they did have mostly sat piled on cots. This one kills me. One boy kept his teddy bear tied to a lanyard so he wouldn't lose it. So this team brought in 700 Bibles that had been donated by a Young Life supporter, and each Bible had 3 stickers, one with a human trafficking hotline, one with a link to Young Life ministry, and one with the first verse of Genesis in Spanish with blanks for the children to write their names. And they found that many of these kids, especially those from the Central American countries, came from evangelical homes. So Chavez's ministries and his messages, which were father-centric, and the words on the Bibles were familiar and were comforting. And Chavez said he felt like God told him the children were spiritual seeds that the Lord wanted to scatter all over the U.S. Our God is the God of little details, Chavez said. Every time I go there, I see his hand. He described Bible studies and discipleship as loudspeakers would be calling out names of boys that were being called out and sent along. At one point, he was talking to them about the new clothing of the gospel and putting on the shoes of the gospel of peace and new shoes, and realized most of these boys were in the government-issued shoes they had been given. So they ended up getting $1,000 from one of the local churches and emptying the shelves at Walmart to take new shoes in for these boys. Finally, on May 22nd, there were only 66 boys left in the facility. And the Homeland Security staff ordered pizzas for everyone. Then the boys were loaded on buses and sent away. And Chavez stayed until the last bus left. Around midnight, he raised his hands to pray over the boys on the road and to commission them to carry the gospel across the nation. They know about you because of missionaries who were sent out of this nation, Chavez said. Now it's this nation that needs the seed. Where others saw danger and peril and problems among these 1,500 13 to 18-year-old boys, Chavez saw young men sent out on a mission. And I wonder, where others saw Ruth the Moabite from Moab, God saw someone sent through whom he would bring about the salvation not only of Israel but the world. I wonder where God is still redeeming stories with the gift of strangers that are sent among us. And will we see and receive? Let's pray.